For our next educational session, Adam Stoker with Relic and the Destination Marketing Podcast will be sharing about the power of storytelling and owned media. Adam is co-founder, president, and CEO of Relic, a full-service advertising agency specializing in tourism marketing. For over 15 years, Adam has been working with leisure travel, stakeholder engagement, destination branding, and convention marketing. Adam also hosts the Destination Marketing Podcast, a weekly podcast featuring discussions with industry professionals worldwide to share their insights and experiences. His book, Touchpoints, The Destination Marketer's Guide to Brand Evaluation and Enhancement, was published in 2020 and is available on Amazon. He will soon release his second book about owned media and storytelling for tourism destinations. Welcome.
Thanks, Bob. I got to tell ChatGPT to keep that under 50 words. First of all, I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I want to start with that. But I've heard a lot of comments today about controlling the weather, and Stuart has been trying to distance himself from that balloon, and I'm just wondering what lengths he will go to try to increase visitation to Myrtle Beach. I'm really excited to chat with everybody today, and I appreciate the opportunity. I speak on this subject all over the country. I've had the opportunity to speak at the Montana Tourism Conference, the Arkansas Tourism Conference this year, and this has been a really important subject. I want to lead with the fact that in going all over the country and talking about this subject, I haven't encountered a destination that has been as forward-thinking and on top of this concept of storytelling and owned media like Visit Myrtle Beach. And I'm really, really impressed with what I've seen. I also, I'm impressed with the fact that AI is such an important part of this conversation today. It's very clear that you have a group that is looking to the future to make sure to build a legacy for Visit Myrtle Beach and to continue to grow the destination. And I think that's admirable because I see a lot of destinations that you're kind of seeing the same regurgitated content at these types of events. Really great to be here and to be a part of this. I want to go ahead and dive in. Bob touched on a couple of things. I need the clicker. I was like, when's this going to change? All right. So Bob mentioned that I wrote a book called Touchpoints. And Touchpoints is the Destination Marketer's Guide to Brand Evaluation and Enhancement. And of course, the moment it went to print, I was like, there's 10 more things I'd like to have in there. So if you want a free copy, send me an email, but I would wait for book number 2 that's on its way out here pretty soon. But the reason I highlight this book to start is because the thesis of the book is that your brand is the sum of all the touch points your organization has with the outside world. And as each of you has an individual organization that you represent, I want you to think about the different touch points that you have, because of course your advertising is a touch point, right? The message that people see in the media. But also when they sit down at a restaurant, the interaction they have with a waiter is another touch point. The front desk experience is another touch point. Now, I had the opportunity last week to experience Myrtle Beach as a visitor. For my 40th birthday, my dad and my brother and I and a close friend came and spent 3 days, 36 holes of golf a day, and had just an incredible time. Actually got to play the Dunes course where that PGA event is coming. And there was a lot of amazing touch points that we had here in Myrtle Beach, and the experience was incredible. But as you think about the touch points with your organization, the thing to keep in mind is that there's touch points that you can control, and there's touch points that you can't control. And I believe that by doing the very best that you can with the touch points you have control of, the touch points you can't control will be influenced positively. So for example, if someone comes to your destination like me and has a great experience golfing, and then a friend of theirs texts them, like I had this last night when I was on the plane, a friend texted me and said, hey, I saw your Instagram post. We're thinking about doing a golf trip in March of next year. What did you think? That conversation you have no control of, right? But because I had an incredible experience and the touch points that I had while I was here were so good, what do you think I said to my buddy that texted me, right? And so that's kind of the thesis of my book. But where that leads into this topic is I want to know, are you controlling the telling of your story? And if you're not the person in control of your story, then I think it's really important that changes as quickly as possible. So to give you some insight on why this is a topic for me, it's something that I actually kind of stumbled into. I own an advertising agency called Relic, and we work with tourism destinations all over the country. And with this agency, we started out very similar to most agencies that you'll run into. We help with traditional media, we help with digital marketing, product development, all that kind of stuff. But I actually had a situation where in 2012, I was very early in the process. We didn't have a tourism client yet, and I walked into the Cedar City, Utah tourism office, and I asked them if they needed help with their marketing. And they said, as a matter of fact, we do. And next thing you know, they were our first tourism client, and then several of their stakeholders, and then referrals, and next thing you know, tourism is 40% of our business. We loved it so much that in 2016, when I acquired the organization, we decided to go all in on tourism. And it's been an amazing ride, but the point of that is, I thought there wasn't much competition for agencies in the tourism industry. And then I got in and decided to go all in and realized, holy cow, outside of Utah, there's a whole lot of agencies that work in tourism. So I said, I've got to have some sort of credibility piece where I can send people and they'll know that I know what the heck I'm talking about, right? And so I started a podcast in 2019, and that podcast is called the Destination Marketing Podcast. And since that time, in 2019 when I started it, it has become either the largest and most impactful podcast in the industry or close to it as far as I can tell. I don't have everybody's numbers. But there's only about 10,000 or so destination marketers in the United States. That's people that work in convention and visitors bureaus or DMOs, right? And that's the main people I'm targeting with that podcast. And we've had 92,500 downloads on that show. So our market penetration on that show is very significant. We bring on really smart people. In fact, the way that I met Stuart was I was bringing my family here on vacation, and I reached out and asked him if he could maybe help us with some ideas of what to do on our trip. And he's like, hey, I actually listened to your show, and we kind of built a friendship from there. I had him on my show. I've had Diane on my show. But that was actually how I got to know Myrtle Beach. We've done 250 episodes, and the latest one is on this exact topic that I'm speaking on today. The timing of this couldn't be better, I guess. It's Stuart and I talking about the importance of owned media, and it's actually going to be a 5 or 6 episode series where Stuart and I are going to do a deep dive on the importance of creating owned media for your organization. Once I started that show, though, I had several destinations say, well, could you help us start a podcast? And my immediate response was, well, no, we're an ad agency. That's not really what we do. And then I realized, hey, I probably need to start figuring out how to say yes to this question, right? And so we started with, we had 5 podcasts in the spring of 2020. And right in March when we were about to go live, COVID hit. And so 4 of the 5 podcasts that we were going to launch dropped off. But Rob Wells in Beaufort, South Carolina, I don't know if any of you know Rob, but he's an amazing person. Rob said, you know what, we committed to this, we're going to give it a try. And so they were our first podcast that we launched. And now we work with destinations all over the country and help them create podcasts. And as we went through this process, and it's funny because I was going through this process for myself, creating owned media. And then I started going through creating these shows and owned media assets for destinations, and my vision and understanding continued to expand. Because as I was getting the results for myself, I was also able to pass those results on to the destinations that we were working with. And I came to a realization in that process that there is a huge blind spot in the tourism industry that we've got to solve and that I want to help solve for the industry. So there are 3 different types of media that a good marketer should be nurturing and keeping track of. The first one, which I believe that the tourism industry is really good at, that is earned media. That's public relations, right? Getting other people to tell your story without having to pay for it, right? So public relations efforts, we do it great in the industry. I don't really have to teach it because you guys all know it and get it. Now, if you're in an individual stakeholder organization and you guys aren't doing public relations efforts, it's definitely something that I would take a look at adding to your efforts. So paid media is the next one. And it's funny because whenever I give this presentation, I have to remind everybody I own an advertising agency. I don't hate paid media. Paid media is a very, very important part of a marketing plan. Paid media is how we get immediate results for whether it's our organization, our destination, whatever, right? And so we can do that through digital media, traditional media. It's measurable and effective. When you run media, you can see the results. It's also very transactional, which means you run the ad, they book the trip. It's not necessarily as relationship building. But let's talk about owned media. Now, there's several examples of different types of owned media. You've seen a lot of those today in the presentation that you've gotten from Myrtle Beach. The examples are YouTube channel, podcasts, video series, a streaming series, documentaries. Your email that you send out is an owned media asset. Your website and the content on your website should be an owned media asset, and I love the presentation we got from Miles today on some of the innovative things that they've been doing to help enhance destination websites, starting with Myrtle Beach. And then your social media channels. Now, there is an argument that there's a fourth type of media called shared, and that's because the social media platforms own the channel, but you own the content. And so I'm putting it here under owned media, but I do understand if anybody has an argument that that should get its own category. And then a text messaging list would be another example of types of media. So why is it important? First of all, I compare it to owning a house. You know, if you are renting a house for 10 years, at the end of that 10 years, you're not building equity, you don't necessarily have anything to show for it, right? And it's the same way with when you're running paid media, what you're actually doing is renting access to an audience that someone else has already built. When we run ads on Facebook, Facebook has spent years building that audience, and now we rent access to it, right? But as you think about that, I would think of owned media as hunting versus farming. I don't know if you're familiar with this analogy, but let's pretend, and Stuart actually likes to, we're picking on Stuart today. Ed, I didn't realize Ed was going to be so aggressive before me picking on Stuart. But Stuart jokes about the zombie apocalypse from time to time. And so let's pretend that the zombie apocalypse has come, and you're out with your family on your own, hiding from the zombies, right? There's two ways to get food: hunting and farming. The benefit of hunting is if I go out and I see a deer, I can immediately bring it home and feed my family. However, with farming, I can actually fill my silos and feed my family for the entire year if I do it correctly. Both of them very valuable, both of them very useful, but farming will allow me to build for the long term, right? So that's really how I look at owned media versus paid media. It's hunting versus farming. You also get the ability to control the narrative. You guys have all probably seen situations where a press release goes out to a media outlet, and the media outlet only has room for X amount of words, but your press release was this long, and they choose what stays in and what gets cut out. You don't necessarily have that control. Also, if you're running a paid ad on Facebook, I don't know why I'm picking on Facebook, but I think we'll just keep it going. You can only have 25% of your Facebook ad be text, and then outside of that, the rest of it has to be an image. And so because of that, you don't necessarily get to control the parameters of how your message gets introduced to the audience. And then when you do it right, you also will have a major influence over your paid and earned media efforts. And through owned media, you build a much deeper connection with the audience. You know, it's always funny when I show up at some of these conferences, and people will come up and say, "Oh my gosh, I've heard your voice now for 2 years, and it's weird to put a face with the name," right? And so people feel like they have a relationship with you if they're consuming your content. So let's talk about the value of building an audience. I like to highlight non-tourism examples on this one because I feel like it's important for us to learn from what's happening outside of the industry. Now, if you want more detail on why I feel like that we don't necessarily have the same data and things like that, go listen to the episode with Stuart and I. We actually go deep on that on the episode that released this week. But I use these non-tourism examples. Let's start with Reese Witherspoon. How many of you are familiar with her Hello Sunshine book club? A few of you. Okay, so let me tell you the story of what she did. She started a book club several years ago, and she highlighted books. It was just once a month she'd bring on a book, and the audience kind of continued to grow. And what she started to realize is when she would highlight a book, she would guarantee the success of that book because her audience had gotten so big. And after a while of seeing the success of each of those books, she says, well, I bet I could make these into a movie and have the movie be successful too. So she started a production company. And with that production company, she started guaranteeing that not only would the book be successful, but the movie would be successful. And guess who gets to play the starring role in a couple of those movies? Reese Witherspoon. She owns the whole supply chain of her career now at this point, and recently was able to sell that production company and the entire organization for more than she ever could have made as an actress. And she was doing okay as an actress too. Kim Kardashian, you guys are familiar with Kim Kardashian? Is that a familiar name? Okay, all right. So Kim Kardashian used to get paid a whole lot of money to feature products on her social media channels where she had built a significant audience. The difference is she started to realize that when she would promote these products, they would go on to be successful and make millions, and she was springboarding them into success. And she said, well, why should I continue to just hand off this value? How about I start a private equity firm? I'll buy the companies first, and then I'll share in the success that comes from me springboarding them into action. So she did that, and the private equity firm has been able to help her grow her wealth unnecessarily, I guess, at this point for where she's at. The Daily Wire, how many of you are familiar with the Daily Wire? So the Daily Wire is a conservative podcast network. I'm definitely not endorsing any political messages or anything like that, but the business case is really fascinating because they, as a conservative talk show network, they have said things at times, or hosts have said things at times that have been offensive to people. And so in that process, Harry's Razors was one of their major advertisers. And when a host inevitably said something that people didn't like, Harry's Razors pulled their advertising spend from the Daily Wire. So instead of going and trying to replace that advertising spend, the Daily Wire created a company called Jeremy's Razors. And the whole idea was, how about let's just create our own, we know our audience buys razors. Harry's was really successful with it, so let's start a razor company. And within the first month, they sold 26,000 subscriptions to Jeremy's Razors. I'm no mathematician, but that's a lot of money that they generated off of that, and way more than they ever would have gotten with the advertising contract. The idea is if you build the audience and you have influence over the audience, you can then monetize that audience in a variety of ways. Right? I'm actually going to skip for time Mr. Beast. I'll touch on Good Golf because Kyle mentioned it this morning. Those guys are fascinating. It was a group of 4 guys that decided to get together and just start making content, and now they've built an audience so significant that Visit Myrtle Beach is wanting them to come down and create content from here. But also they've released their own line of golf apparel. They have hats, they have clothes, and the thing is, they built the audience, and then they were able to take commoditized products and leverage their influence over the audience to generate revenue, right? So how we can learn from some of these non-tourism examples is if we build an audience, then we can actually influence that audience and ultimately leverage a travel decision. Here's the problem. It is a long effort. It is not a one-year plan. And for destinations, the reason this is a risk is that when you have stakeholders that want results now, it's actually a very difficult thing to convince them of as, hey, listen, this is a 10-year plan. And so it's very difficult for some destinations to get that going. Another reason I'm really impressed with Myrtle Beach is that your stakeholders have the vision to be able to allow you to build for the long term as opposed to requiring just hunting all the time. So with paid media, there's a couple of concerns. First of all, the costs go up annually with paid media. Again, I don't dislike paid media. I'm just comparing the benefits versus paid and owned. I think it needs to be a mixture of the 3. I want to be clear with that. But with Salesforce, I'm going to use Salesforce. Salesforce is a big tech company, probably the largest CRM in the world for most B2B companies. Okay? So Salesforce, in 4th quarter of last year, they really measure, and excuse me, I said in 4th quarter, but I'm going to talk about 4th quarter in just a minute. They measure their success of their marketing through 2 metrics. What's the cost to acquire a customer, and what's the lifetime value of a customer? Because if I know it costs me $3 to get a customer, which would be amazing as a cost to acquire a customer, but let's say it costs $3 to acquire a customer, and I know that for every customer I acquire, I'm going to make $10 off that customer. I can spend as much advertising dollars as if I want, as long as that equation works. But in fourth quarter of last year, Salesforce cost to acquire a customer went up by 70%. That throws the entire equation off. And if that happened for Salesforce, that's also happening for every organization that's buying through the digital marketing channels that we're buying through, right? So that's another concern with paid media, is it is inherently inflationary because these companies need to continue to make more and more money. I talked about renting versus owning, but I'm gonna touch on, when we think about a paid ad, almost every paid ad is a proverbial billboard. And what I mean by that is that anytime you run a paid advertisement, you essentially have 8 seconds or less to make a connection with the customer. So the reason I say it's like a billboard, pretend you're driving by, right? So if I'm scrolling in an Instagram feed, I probably have less than 8 seconds to grab somebody's attention. And we are asking someone who we don't have a relationship with to book a trip, to book the hotel, to make a reservation at the restaurant, when they don't even know who we are yet. And so my concern with paid media as well is when attention is as divided and fractured and scattered as it's ever been, we're asking the buyer to do too much. So my thought with paid media is the best mix is if we're creating amazing owned media content and we're leveraging paid media to get eyeballs on the owned media content so that we can then work those people through the funnel to ultimately to a purchase or through the buyer's journey. So when we talk about the marketing funnel, remember with paid media, we look at awareness, consideration, and purchase. That's the journey we're trying to walk them through. With owned media, I'm proposing a different journey for the customer. So it still starts with awareness because nobody can consume your content if they don't know who you are, if they've never heard of the content, right? But the second goal is not consideration. It's too early in the process. The second goal is engagement. We want them to engage in some way. We want them to press play on the episode or the YouTube video. We want them to subscribe to wherever it is that we're releasing our content. We want some sort of action, engagement. Then we want them to become part of an active community. And really, we'll get to a slide that's specifically about active community in a moment, but I want you to think about that as permission. Because we know they're part of the active community if they've given us permission to continue to communicate with them. So we'll talk about that in a minute. I skipped forward. Let me go back real quick. Then, once they become part of the active community, we want to inspire them to have interest in booking a trip. And then, of course, we want them to actually purchase. Or if we build an audience that's significant enough, maybe they never even end up coming to Myrtle Beach. But when somebody asks them where they should go for their trip, hey, I'm listening to this show that's super interesting about Myrtle Beach. I haven't been there, but you might want to give it a try. We can create a community of advocates that don't even come to our destination if we create interesting enough content and valuable enough content. So I'm just going to go through each step. I'm going to do it very quickly here because I know we're short on time. How much time do I have? Okay, I'm good. All right. And I know I'm between you guys and a break, so I'm going to hurry. It starts with amazing storytelling. Nobody's going to care about your content unless it's interesting. That's pretty easy. That's why I love the new show that Myrtle Beach has just launched called Life's a Beach and Then You Die. It is really, really human content. It's compelling human content. It tells real stories of real people, and the audience can relate to it. I have no doubt that show is going to be incredible. The destination showcase is a secondary priority there. We are not trying to sell the destination immediately. We're just leveraging the content first to build the relationship with the audience. Now, the destination is in the background, and a great example of that is Myrtle Moms and Margaritas, which I know that Jen is on there, and she's a great talent there. But with that show, how often do you talk about Myrtle Beach? Fairly rarely, but it's very obvious that you're in Myrtle Beach. They hear the sounds of the beach. They hear stakeholders. They hear messages that relate to Myrtle Beach. And that's the whole point. It's a looser connection than Buy Now. And then we want to drive traffic to the content instead of directly to a landing page that says book now, or we don't want to ask too much. So then in the engagement phase, there's an example of some content that you can create. So think of your awareness content as kind of your big rock content. So like a podcast or a YouTube channel or a streaming show or something like that. And then if I want people to engage, I'm going to slice up those big rock pieces of content into little slivers of content that I can use to generate engagement. So think of that as the engagement phase with these different content types. Then the tactics, you can have audience-driven storytelling where you're asking the audience to contribute topics that you should talk about. Meet and greets where you actually put the talent out in the community and people can come interact with them. Merchandise that's related to the show that might also have the Visit Myrtle Beach logo on the back or something like that. Cross-show promotion, so if you have multiple owned media assets, have them make appearances on each show to try to pull audience to other shows and increase your interaction. Then you want people to become part of an active community. And if you can achieve that, you now have permission to walk them through the rest of the process. So we want them to hit subscribe. We want them to join the email list. Maybe they can get a text update when there's unique content that's created. Create social groups where someone has to join the group. An example of that is I've created a group on LinkedIn called Destination Marketers. There's 260 members right now, and I've approved 2 people to join that group today. On the Destination Marketers LinkedIn group. It's a great way for me to continue the conversation with my listeners in a more tangible way. Social follows, if they give you your address, you can actually send them direct mail. And then, of course, you want them to subscribe. Inspiration, at this point in the process, you can actually start to send them personalized content based on your findings in the data from when they gave you permission. So if you've got a good CRM and somebody gives you their email address and you send out an email, they click on that email and go to a certain page on your website. Now you know they're interested in that specific thing, and you can send them content tailored to that specific thing. So it's really important that at this point we're creating customized content to help move them through the journey. And then, of course, the purchase phase, we want them to make a purchase, hopefully. There we go. And then, of course, you get the stronger call to action at this point. So it's a much longer journey, but the idea is we are farming, right? We are building an audience that if we're successful in building that audience, we can now leverage that audience in ways that I'll show in just a moment. So I'm going to talk about podcasts briefly. The reason I'm going to talk about podcasts is I feel like they are the easiest owned media asset to create. It's the most inexpensive, and all you need is a microphone. Okay, so with podcasts, a couple things to be aware of. 55% of Americans have listened to a podcast. 37% of those listen once a month, and 24% of them listen weekly. Podcasts have an amazing penetration into the audience in the United States. Here's the other reason I like podcasts as a place to get started. I talked about how we're asking too much of the visitor in some of our ads. I look at podcasts, and the reason they've been so successful is this idea of passive consumption versus active consumption. You have all probably spent a lot of money writing tons of content on your website that nobody reads. So when you want someone to read the content on your website, you want them to sit down, give you their full attention, and read through line by line, and then click on the page and read through. It's very difficult in today's day and age to make that happen. I'm not saying websites aren't valuable, because they are, and they're necessary. They're another really important asset, okay? But podcasts give you the ability to listen on your terms. I can consume content in the shower. I can consume content driving in my car, folding laundry, at the gym, whatever I'm doing. It's passive consumption, and audio is the only format that gives you the ability to consume passively, and that's why I think it's been so successful. 80% of listeners also listen to most or all of a single episode. Why? Because we're telling a story, and if you heard 60% of the story, you want to hear the end, right? So if you're doing a good job of storytelling in a podcast, they're also going to listen to most or all of your episode. Here's the other great thing about a podcast, is if you do it right, you can slice, and sorry about Chevy Chase here, you can slice and dice this content into a dozen different usable assets. So for example, if I transcribe the podcast, and there's software that'll do that for nothing. ChatGPT actually could probably do that for nothing now. But but if you transcribe it and upload that to your website, what's going to happen? That is keyword-rich content that's going to help your search engine optimization. You'll pop up higher in Google, right? So that's a super easy, inexpensive thing that you can do with that. The second thing you can do is divide it up into multiple blog posts. You can also take that same content and cut video shorts from it, or audio shorts with just a static image on the screen if you don't have the ability to edit video. It's also evergreen content. When you run an ad and it goes by the customer, it's gone. When you build owned media content like a podcast, it's evergreen, it's there forever. And what I have constantly, the first episode of my show, albeit a miserable episode compared to where we are today, like there was a lot of learning that took place, but my first episode still gets tons of listens, and it's because people find me midway through, and then they want to go back and listen from the beginning. And Alex, I'm sure you're the same way. Yeah, it's really interesting that people want to go back and hear more of the story. And so I look at every episode for a destination or a tourism-based organization as a part of the story. So now you get a huge amount of time to be able to tell your story to your audience. So what's the point? If you build this audience, you can then leverage this audience to do a variety of things. First of all, as a destination, we'll talk about it from a Visit Myrtle Beach perspective, if they build audiences that they influence, and one of you as a stakeholder is struggling, they actually have the ability to influence the visitation to your business by telling your story on one of their shows. I have a friend that owns a resort in Utah called Ruby's Inn. It's at the mouth of Bryce Canyon, one of my clients. And he, for years, has called me leading up to August. There's like the week in the middle of August that's right before everybody goes back to school. Suddenly their bookings are way down. And so he always wants to run a campaign to generate visitation. But if he owned an audience, and I've been trying to talk him into it, but if he owned an audience, he could instead feature the destination on his show and talk about when is the best time to visit and actually influence the visitation himself instead of needing to run a $20,000 media campaign for a week. And that's the power of building an audience. You can fill in shoulder seasons. You can get better research and feedback from visitors. You can influence return visitation because if you've built a relationship with them and they came and had an amazing experience, you can show them through your content things that they didn't get the opportunity to experience while they were here. So they're going to want to come back, right? And then you can just create a ton of content on a limited budget. So for people that don't have the ability to do it themselves, even though I promise it's easier than it sounds, my team has a turnkey product that we do for all of the destinations and other organizations that we work with, and we'd be happy to help anybody that's interested, but I promise you, no matter who you are, you do have the ability to try it and do it on your own.